In this video, I briefly discuss the history of nuclear negotiations with Iran, as well as the content of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, the deal that was reached in 2015. My key point is that the JCPOA was the outcome of over a decade of talks sanctioned by the UN Security Council. While it did not address all international concerns about Iran's nuclear program and other activities, it did lengthen the amount of time Iran needs to produce enough material for a nuclear weapon from 3 months to 1 year, restoring U.S. credibility in negotiations after withdrawing from the agreement in 2018 will take both time and effort. First, I want to clarify Iran's underlying obligations about its nuclear program. Iran is a signatory to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT. The NPT gives Iran the right to a nuclear energy program in exchange for a commitment to not develop nuclear weapons and allow regular inspections of its nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. In 1997, the IAEA developed the Additional Protocol to the Safeguards Agreement of the NPT, which provides for additional, more intrusive inspections and requirements to provide more information on nuclear research. 136 of the 190 signatories to the NPT have implemented the Additional Protocol. Iran signed an Additional Protocol agreement with the IAEA in 2003, but never ratified it and stopped implementing it in 2006. So Iran has been engaged in negotiations with the international community about its nuclear program off and on for the past 20 years. The two most significant sets of talks were the E3 talks from 2003 to 2006 and the P5+1 talks from 2012 to 2015. Just FYI, E3 stands for the European Three, that's the UK, France, and Germany, and the P5+1, sometimes also called the E3+3, are the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. The EU was also represented as an institution in all of these talks. The E3 talks began after secret uranium reprocessing facilities at Natanz and Arak were made public in 2002. After talks with the IAEA and E3 in 2003, Iran did agree to suspend all uranium enrichment activities and signed the Additional Protocol. The IAEA, though, rebuked Iran for non-cooperation with inspections in 2004, and in response, Iran said it would no longer suspend enrichment. More E3 talks ensued, and Iran agreed again to suspend enrichment at the end of 2004. The next year, however, Iran again announced it produced a precursor element for uranium enrichment. The E3 ended talks, and the IAEA found Iran in non-compliance with its Safeguards Agreement. It referred the file to the UN Security Council for action. Iran first enriched uranium in 2006, which was then followed by 3 rounds of sanctions passed by the UNSC. The U.S. decided to join the nuclear talks, now in the format of P5+1 negotiations, since the file is with the UNSC, after Obama was elected. But the talks were sporadic and produced little. The main ideas discussed at this time were freeze for freeze and fuel swaps. Freeze for freeze is the idea that Iran would freeze its enrichment activities and the international community would freeze the implementation of sanctions. Fuel swaps are when Iran ships its low-enriched uranium out of the country and receives 20% enriched uranium suitable for medical research in return. Freeze for freeze never went anywhere, but Iran agreed to a fuel swap in 2010. The P5+1 talks intensified after the United States passed unilateral sanctions on Iran's financial sector, and the EU passed a ban on importing Iranian oil in 2012. After repeated rounds of negotiations, the P5+1 and Iran agreed to a Joint Plan of Action, or JPOA, in January 2014. This agreement was a version of freeze for freeze. It was a confidence-building measure in which Iran froze nuclear activities in exchange for the temporary waiver of certain sanctions. While that agreement was being implemented, many additional talks were held, and in July 2015, Iran and the P5+1 agreed to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. The JCPOA is a 15-year agreement in which Iran rolled back its nuclear activities in exchange for the suspension of economic sanctions. It essentially cut off the plutonium path for Iran during this time period, both by having Iran produce less plutonium and by having it ship out its spent fuel rods that can be converted into plutonium. It significantly reduced Iran's uranium enrichment capacity, limiting the number of centrifuges Iran could run, the percent it could enrich to, and the amount of enriched uranium it could possess. It also provided for enhanced inspections of nuclear facilities. In exchange, the EU and UN sanctions on Iran were removed or suspended, and the US eased its sanctions on Iran's banking sector. The JCPOA marked a significant limitation on Iran's nuclear capabilities. In particular, it extended Iran's breakout time. That's the amount of time Iran would need to produce enough nuclear material for one weapon. The breakout time was extended from 2 or 3 months to around 1 year. The agreement did, however, have its limits. Some significant concessions by the international community included not having any time, anywhere inspections. There is a process for inspecting undeclared facilities, but it is slow, as well as not requiring Iran to acknowledge its past military-related nuclear activities. Issues such as Iran's ballistic missile program or a complete ban on enrichment were essentially non-starters. Iran refused to accept these as part of the terms of negotiation. Implementation of the agreement was generally pretty good. Iran did make some technical violations early on, but they were resolved according to the procedures set up by the JCPOA. Iran also complained about the slow implementations of sanctions relief, but the problem was more Iran's poor business climate than the actual lifting of sanctions. The United States withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018 and reimposed banking sanctions on Iran later that year as part of a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. The U.S. demands of Iran as part of this pressure campaign, including ending all enrichment, ballistic missile development, and support for terrorism, were generally things Iran has refused to discuss since 2006, if at all. Iran has taken a few steps in response to the U.S. withdrawal, specifically stating it would resume stockpiling enriched uranium and begin enriching at higher levels. But these steps have so far been limited, enriching to 4.5% rather than 3.5%, for example. The United States has significant leverage over Iran through banking sanctions, but its unilateral withdrawal from the treaty led to the loss of support of its allies for its Iran policy, including an embarrassing loss on a UN Security Council vote on the extension of a UN arms embargo on Iran. Although the election of Joe Biden as president will make the United States more open to negotiations, it's unclear to me whether rejoining the JCPOA is really an option. Iran has said that they are not going to simply ignore the past 4 years, and it's difficult to imagine the United States not seeking additional actions from Iran before suspending banking sanctions again. Some kind of phased return of the JCPOA might be possible, but it was never really meant to be the final nuclear deal with Iran. Rather, the JCPOA was meant to be the beginning of more negotiations on the harder issues. U.S. credibility in talks has been significantly damaged, however, and it will take time to repair.